Ali, welcome. It's such a pleasure to have you with us today.
Andrew, it's so nice to be here. Thank you for that.
Ali, can you share with our audience where your passion for human flourishing started?
The simple answer is when I was building for a big, large insurance firm called AXA, the Global Mind Health Index. This is looking at the, if you like, simply put, the mental health of 16 countries. We had to think about how to measure that using an index capability. So we studied very carefully what the various different aspects we wanted to measure in a person's mental health. We had some fantastic questions ready. And typically, what you do is you measure and express that measurement from 0 to 100, for example. And I couldn't quite bring myself to express a person's value of their mental health in a number. It needed something more human. So we started researching as a team, and I came across Marty Seligman's work. I came across Corey Keyes' work. I was very inspired by the work that they had done. And what they did was they expressed a person in the context of flourishing, or they were struggling. And in between, they happened to be languishing or floundering as well. So we started to think about the benchmark areas and how to climb from 0 to 100 in a stepped way. So we re-expressed the numbers as you are struggling in your mind health, you are languishing, getting by, or flourishing. That expression really caught the attention of the global community that we served. And that's when I knew that we had a really nice way of expressing the value of what's not just going on in a person's mind, but person's body and their environment as well. So that's how it started.
Can you dive deeper into what human flourishing is all about? How do we define it? How do we experience it so our listeners can truly embrace it more deeply?
Sure, there's a lot of work being done around this very area. So there is no single global, unified, universal way of expressing what flourishing means. But there are some really good academic attempts at this. There are a number of studies that are being performed. So let's take, for example, the starting point that Tyler Vanderweel and Byron Johnson, both at Harvard and Baylor universities respectively, they've started the Global Flourishing Study. And in the Harvard Human Flourishing Program, they are expressing it as a state in which all aspects of life are good. And it breaks down into 6 key areas. So you can get into both the mental and physical health, but they also progress into financial stability, as well as something I find really quite intriguing, character and virtue. Not something that we naturally think about as humans, and not something that we think that we could really easily measure either, but intangibles are entirely possible both to measure and express. So there are a number of other people who have come up with their own particular measures, and the measures actually will need to work back from the thesis. What are you actually trying to identify flourishing in, for example? So in SHAPE, we center it around the context of human performance at work. And so we look at people's actions and experiences, or we like to think of them in another way as the conditions and the behaviors in which people are in and around at work. That enables us to better measure and then express that back. And we express it back as you are struggling, striving to flourish, or flourishing in the aspects that actually make up the ability for you to flourish. So, for example, it may be the relationships you are flourishing in around you, or it might be you are flourishing with the culture of the company, or you could be struggling with the mental health for yourself, or you could be struggling or striving in engagement or life outside of work. Now, I've met a number of other people who look at it from a different lens. For example, I'm now talking to some friends. They don't look at it being absolute. Not all aspects of life are flourishing, but most aspects of life are flourishing. Now, this is a really technical and scientific thing here, but simply put, at a human level, we can actually have poor mental health and still show up to work. Actually, we can have poor mental health and poor physical health and still show up to work, but the chance of us performing at the same time starts to erode. Now, when you add up over all the different factors that we need to think about that we could possibly be flourishing in, the reality is, as the human state goes, it's very, very difficult to be flourishing in all of them at the same time, all of the time. So this is where we're starting to understand that we can re-articulate the true nature of human flourishing as from being all absolutist to most instead.
So, in your TEDx talk, you focus on the flourishing zone within organizations in order to fuel performance. What would be some tips or insights that you can share for our listeners that are leaders today who want to make sure that as many of their people as possible are within that flourishing zone? What would be the key tips that you would share with them to elevate the flourishing?
The answer is somewhat disturbing, actually. In order for people to flourish, what we need to do is we need to get to the truth. And the reality is, for example, a lot of the data that we collect about humans is inaccurate. Those HR surveys, they're not actually constructed to be as accurate as possible. The true nature of a lot of the tools in the world today, they're not hitting up to the standard that we need. So what does that mean? We're getting data that doesn't give us the true hidden nature and reveal what needs to be addressed. And if we can't know that as leaders, then we're actually addressing the wrong things potentially, and even worse, missing them altogether. So to truly flourish, what we need is to understand that flourishing and performance come together. When people flourish with the relationships around them, when they flourish, for example, in engaging other members of staff around them, when they have got a great relationship with their manager, when they have a good control factor over simple things like lighting and heating, these are factors that are measured and cited science as being able to impact your ability to flourish, to perform. And organizations, what they have a contract of performance with every individual employee. And they have a responsibility to ensure that the individual is empowered to look after themselves and play their part. But equally, the management team needs to understand it's not all on the individual. In fact, what we found in our data, up to 70% of the factors that affect performance sit in the domain responsibility of both the manager and the executive team, and therefore the policies of the company. So by understanding these models and understanding which factor sits in which domain, we can then start to actually be much more accountable, and we can start to take better action. So flourishing is a necessity to understand the whole human. And that's what this is about. By looking at just mental health, we're not looking at the whole human. And what's even worse in organizations, what they're also doing is they're potentially doing the right things, but they're doing them in a distributed way. So that means HR is looking at it from their perspective, facilities management is looking at it from their perspective, and then you've got occupational health, wellbeing, DEI programs. Everybody is collecting their understanding. They're not connecting the dots. And like I think about AI is only powerful when you give it context. Well, if you have these disparate data points all separated out, you don't get to understand the full picture. And so we don't run an entire organization on just 2 departments worth of data. Then why are we operating the whole human and the environment for them on just a few data points? So the whole human is necessary, and that's what the principle of flourishing is about.
How do you connect the topic of joy to flourishing based on all your research to date?
Yeah, so, the science behind joy, actually, when you look at the human factors or what we call the subconstructs of joy, you would need to actually understand that a human has a certain type of experience. For example, do they feel deeply fulfilled? A good friend of mine, Dr. Matt Lee, who is a researcher at Harvard on the Human Flourishing Program and a professor at Baylor, he says it really well. He says it's about relational feeling. So do I have relational depth in that relationship I have with the person? Another good friend of mine, she calls it relational intelligence. And so these are the kind of subconstructs we don't really tend to really dig down deeper into. We tend to surface layer happiness and pretty much stop there and equate that to joy. So when we look at these human factors that we can positively impact, then we start to actually understand that joy is something that really comes from other humans being around you and the connection between the two. So that's just one of many aspects. And so when I look at it from somewhat the scientific lens, we're able to actually put that into a measure. We're able to look at, is that person getting that depth of feeling in that relationship? Are they feeling secure, psychologically safe? That's the baseline. But as they climb up the ladder to having a deeper connected set of experiences with other individuals in certain environments. We can even start to look at, can environments be designed to actually almost manufacture and bring artificial sense of joy, which is exactly what we want to try to achieve with every ounce that we can possibly make happen. So I look at it from somewhat a very human perspective, but also a mechanical perspective, and try to bring the two together to measure it.
What is a link that you have found between flourishing joy and also purpose, particularly organizational purpose, and how that contributes to human flourishing?
These connections coming together of multiple different pieces actually start to surface the real value of purpose in that construct of joy. So a person who has deep, meaningful connection with their purpose in what they want to achieve, are they likely to enjoy that endeavor, the journey to get there to that destination? I was listening to a talk actually. I must attribute this to where I heard it to Simon Sinek. He was actually collecting the information about sports, and we work in sports data as well. And what we find in sports is that the sports people on the field, they actually speak to themselves in those moments where the goal didn't hit or they didn't quite get the point. They actually console themselves, and they have a difficult time trying to get through that period. But what gets them through is the joy, the love for what they do. So in flourishing, there is a lot of study now being done that correlates to love as well. And so for me, these deeply emotional states that really make us human, this is who we are as human beings, this is what defines us, is this social nature coming out. And in the studies, looking at it from joy and looking at it from love gives us the ability to start to understand the value and the necessity and the absolute investment that we must make in these.
How do you see AI and the accelerated speed at which companies are not only deploying AI, but also initiating layoffs, often using AI as a reason for those layoffs? So, what is your view on how AI will impact human flourishing at work?
Thank you so much. I have the good fortune of actually being in the inner council of the AI for Human Flourishing, convened together by the Flourishing Network at Harvard's Human Flourishing program. And we are looking into understanding how to build a better relationship with AI through the context of the principles of human flourishing. So, for example, can a product actually enable flourishing, or has it been designed with the human in mind? And I'm currently also working with a wonderful group of people that are asking some very profound questions. For example, is AI optimized for human attention or human flourishing? Now, you see how profound that can be. So we have to go right into the core, the center. We have to really inspire the ChatGPTs of the world, the bigger players, to understand this, the Anthropics, that the impact that we're seeing downstream as a result happens to be this. And with regards to the organizations, we're living in a capitalist society. We loved that. We love making money, but we don't like the fact that now there's an impact on humans. What are organizations meant to do? Not that I'm taking a position here or, pro-social or pro-capitalist. I'm stating, I think, what is the obvious. What were we expecting? So when I'm speaking to leaders, they actually want to virtue signal, quite frankly, if nothing else, that, we are absolutely all for humans, but we're going to have to lay off this group of people. We don't need them anymore. So the first thing is AI is going to impact and disrupt business. Absolutely will happen. Every couple of weeks, we're seeing more and more news in the media about this happening, and businesses are becoming more and more direct and brave about the fact that this is the reason why it's happening. But it can only be solved if the mantra changes, I think personally, if the principle changes, if we have a role in society that we understand. And this is what it used to be before, the 1960s and the 50s, for example. If we look back at, anthropology and the role of that within organizations, there was a deeper rooted responsibility that organizations took within their role of society. Now they don't seem to have that. They seem to, express that they're doing certain things, but when you look at under the construct, of the science, the statistics, the measures, you find that actually it's quite ineffective. And I'm not the first to say this. Studies have found the same thing. So I think it's your guess as much as mine how organizations will continue to impact humans within organizations. That's where my focus happens to be. How do we enable people to actually become much more capable to work with AI rather than actually become victims of it?
I'm thinking about the younger generations, those in their early 20s that are beginning their career journeys. How do you suggest that they move forward in order to ensure their own human flourishing in this societal and organizational shifts that we're seeing?
And it's a really big worry for me personally. I'm the father of now an 18-year-old, a 22 and a 24-year-old. My 24-year-old's quite secure. He's working quite well. So if I talk from a personal perspective, I'm really quite worried about the youth at the moment. The system is not ready for this. Michael Stevenson was commissioned by the OECD to put together an understanding of education systems in the OECD countries, what's happening, what's going right, what's not going so well. And he created a fairly hefty report and released it in December of 2025. And it said quite clearly the education systems are not up to par. Not for a world where AI is going to have the impact it's going to. We know it's already having. But the good news is he actually sets his conceptual framework for the North Star for all education systems being human flourishing. So to me, it starts with education first. Education has to be much, much more equipped to build a bridge between the world of learning and the world of application. And that bridge is something that I'm quite proud to say that I'm also working in and on to try to find a pioneering way to equip our youth so they can actually hit the ground running in a much better way. And with regards to what can, education is one thing, organizations have to play a part, but what can individual, younger people do? Well, first of all, I don't see enough experimentation happening. There is a real burden of pioneering, being brave, getting hands on, just do it type of approach needing to be taken on board. Because the reality is, again, they're coming fresh out of university, they're coming fresh out of colleges, and they haven't got to speed yet. There is a small group of people who do have the tenacity, do have the understanding to actually play with the tools and build the tools. So I would say get hands on, start learning the tools that are already available. It is difficult because the velocity at which tools keep on evolving, never seen anything like it in my life. It's so fast. But that's the reality of the situation we're in. Now, opportunities will arise where employers will be looking for people who have not just got a core capability in creativity, but creativity and the ability to employ it and or deploy it using AI. That's exactly what I would be looking for that's exactly what I always advise the younger people that I meet to gain the skills. It's skills acquisition is the route forward.
In your TED Talk, you shared that flourishing is a journey. What would be the recipe, in your view, if we now talk about flourishing and combining it with the dimension of joy? What would be the key ingredients for living a life that is filled with more joy and deep flourishing?
Well, we know from the Harvard Grant study, which is one of the longest studies, in modern times, we find the same thing again and again. When you ask a person many, many years into the future, when they're at the twilight of both their career and perhaps life, the thing that they call out the most that they really enjoyed was social connection, that depth of connection. So it's always about people. And I think along the way, if we can find the moments that become beyond moments, they become the mainstay, they become the standard way that we do things. So can we build teams where people just absolutely love being together? Can we build relationships in every sphere of life, in communities? Can we enable those? And in reality, in my professorship at the University of Huddersfield, I'm working together with Professor Liz Towns-Andrews, and we're trying to define a flourishing zone, a space where a highly deprived community can actually get access to the resources and the services that they most need to both help themselves and play their part, as well as get access from the system support to enable them to go from what is quite frankly perpetual struggling to perpetual flourishing. And so I look at flourishing as being not just a permanent state and a destination. It's a state at which we go through life. Because the reality of life, it's like a radio wave. Sometimes it's a long wave, it's going quite well. Sometimes it's a little bit sharper. And those peaks and troughs, what we need to try to do is to make those troughs shallower. And that depth that we can actually remove and make it shallower, that's a better chance for a person to actually limit their need to struggle and improve their ability to flourish. So we can do that by design. We can design environments, we can design teams, we can design departments, we can design relationships. And now I'm looking at can we design communities where that can happen as well. Early days, but I'll keep you posted.
Is there anything else that you believe we should have talked about when it connects to your passion around human flourishing, but that we did not cover until now?
Yeah, thank you, Andrea. I think when I look at the biggest contribution I can make from the work that I'm doing, I've been really thinking hard about how do I express that? And it's definitely about measurement and it's definitely about humanity. So can we merge these together? And what I found is that a lot of people don't believe you can measure these very difficult, intangible things. Like, can you measure the value of a relationship? Can you measure trust? Can you measure respect? These are very difficult things, but yet they have profound impact. Imagine working in a team where you don't feel respected. Imagine working for a manager who doesn't trust you. So these are real, these are tangible things. And we can't deal with them because we feel that we can't express them. Well, the reality is we can. And it's not a science that I've made up, it's a behavioral science that actually the best academics in the world have already put together. So we're trying to make sure that we can enable anybody to measure anything they like using those validated constructs. And we're building the AI to make that happen. And in simpler terms, that means, can you measure? Yes. Can you express it? That's an index. Can we build indices that help us measure the most complex things around us? Well, the answer is yes. So we're trying our hardest to build that capability to enable organizations to truly ask themselves the difficult questions. What's happening when there's an erosion of trust in our business? What does that mean for our bottom line? We're trying to get to that far. We're trying to connect these very human factors and link them through to boardroom metrics that really move the management teams. So I think that would be really good for people to just hear, first of all, the message that yes, you can measure, you can understand, and you can act upon incredibly difficult things that you know that make a difference, but you haven't quite been able to express it before.
What is an optimal frequency of measurement? Because people change, competition changes. There's so many shifts that are so fast. What would be the ideal frequency to actually measure some of these metrics that relate to human flourishing?
The science of this is actually really fairly straightforward, and I'll explain it this way. Every question we ask a person actually has an accuracy measure against it. So we call that a p-value, for example. And it also has something called a validity curve. So there is a period for which that particular question will be valid. Now, I'll give you an example, make it practical. We use something called the depression, anxiety, and stress scales to help you understand whether you are depressed, anxious, or stressed, and that helps you get an understanding of mental well-being. Now, in the question, it says, over the past week, and anybody answering those questions normally thinks it's only valid for a week, but actually, it's valid for up to 14 weeks. The reality is that you don't need to go back for up until 3 to 4 months at a time till you measure again. And so we have crafted validity curves and what we call dose responses, just like you would expect in medical science, to understand the validity and the depth of that validity for however long that's going to be, that depth of time. And that gives us an ability to understand when is the next best time to ask. Now, culture, for example, culture very rarely changes. It's a very slow moving beast, so 6 to 8 months on average.
If you could give our listeners a challenge to pursue this week, given everything that we have discussed today, what would that challenge be?
Wow. Yeah. Okay. If you could change one thing in a relationship that you have with a person you know who needs your help, and you can change their outcome, I do that. That's the challenge. It's about paying it forward.
Love that. Ali, it's been an immense pleasure to speak with you today. Thank you so much for all the wisdom you have shared.
Thank you for having me. Such a pleasure.